Welcome to Refused Flank, a wargaming podcast exploring the intersection of competitive excellence and narrative storytelling potential.
Don't put them on the side, taking up like 80,000 square feet or whatever. Okay.
One step at a time.
Yep.
All right, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Okay, so this is Grant. You're listening to, Refused Flank. This week we're going to be talking about deployment, both just kind of strategies, but also how game systems handle it, different ways that they implement deployment, what gets us excited about different ways that these game systems handle deployment, etc., all about deployment, your one-stop shop.
Yes. And then at the very end, we'll throw out some general strategies for ways that you can approach deployment, maybe ways that you can get a little bit better at it, that sort of a thing. But yeah, let's just dive in with deployment is obviously an essential part of any war game.
It's the start.
Yeah, it's hard. You'd be hard pressed to find a game that doesn't have deployment because somehow you got to get your army from the box onto the battlefield. And so whether that's sort of built into the setup or it's part of the first turn of the game or whatever the case may be, you're going to be deploying your troops in one way or another.
And I want to just add here too, just not that we necessarily have to say this, but we're assuming like rules out of the box deployment, not like we wrote a custom scenario with weird rules. So our guys all airdrop out of the sky for this one only, whereas your guys come out of the hole in the ground over there. We're talking like rules as written. How does deployment happen typically?
Right. Because if you're writing a special scenario, it's obviously special. So it's not going to be the normal type of deployment, that sort of thing. So a lot of what we're talking about could be applied to really any game system if you want to write a special scenario that does it.
Right. So for me, just to jump us off, and maybe you'll have a different view. In most of the systems I've played, there seems to be two kind of schools of implementation or thought. There's either there's going to be some kind of roll-off that forces one player to go first, and then they either do one of two things. They deploy one unit, and then it kind of popcorns, or they deploy their entire force, and then maybe there's like a scouting move or something, or some guys that hold back for a second round of deployment. Mm-hmm. There always seems to be that. And then the other player either, does their whole force, and then the second round kind of goes. And then the distances up or where they are physically deploying may change scenario from scenario, but that seems to account for 90% plus of game systems handle deployment, and I understand why. It's simple. Mm-hmm. It's easy to understand, and it gets people onto the board pretty quickly, but it also has some tactical options for most games because, we're on a table here. We have limited space, so you have to kind of work within these confines. You're not actually over at Waterloo. You can't we'll just stretch the 10,000 guys infinitely that way. We have to fit on here, so there's constraints.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of other deployment types are really minor variations on that. I know a lot of saga scenarios will have you divide your warband into two sections, and then I'll deploy sort of like half my warband, then you deploy half, then I deploy half, then you deploy half, or something like that. Okay. So it's alternating, but it's sort of like splitting the difference between full army versus individual alternating. And then, like you said, things where you maybe are drip feeding your army onto the battlefield throughout the battle in different ways, and that can be implemented through things like reserve roles, which you might be familiar with from different Warhammer systems and things like that. But something like chain of command, you're also throughout the battle slowly deploying your troops kind of as you're able and when you want to, when it's tactically advantageous, that sort of a thing. But yeah, that's I think covers a lot of what there is. If you guys know of other kind of bespoke or really interesting systems for how deployment can be done that breaks out of that box, we'd love to hear about it.
Right.
Because I know there's always new systems coming out, new games that are trying to do new and interesting things with that.
What do you think are the benefits of, say, doing or negatives of doing kind of everything all at once? Like, I'll say War Machine Mark II or whatever, steamroll. You just put out your whole army, and then the opponent puts out their whole army, and then there's the second phase too or whatever, versus the popcorning.
Yeah, I think the benefit gain from being able to react to how your opponent deployed feels pretty powerful. And so I know in alternating deployment systems, that's something I'm always thinking about is I kind of want to hold back deploying this unit because I want to wait and see where they put that unit that I know they're going to put down. So maybe, for example, I know they have a tank, so I'm not going to put down my anti-tank weapon until I know where they put their tank because I want to put it kind of in that vicinity where I'm going to be able to use what I have to deal with a specific threat
Sure.
actually lined up against it, that sort of a thing. So I think doing a whole army at once gives an advantage to the person deploying second because they have the ability to fully respond in every way to what their opponent was doing with their initial deployment.
I agree. I've generally, since playing a few more things, I've come more and more towards liking the more reaction thing. The only real negative I can think of is just the tangible one of it takes longer, I think.
Because you're humming and hawing and thinking like, ooh, do I want to do this unit or that unit?
Yeah, oftentimes these games just can already last 3, 4, it's a big game, 5 hours. And then you talk about the whole social aspect. Everybody shows up, we chat for 30 minutes before anything even really happens. And then you add on another 20-minute deployment phase where everybody's going back and forth. That's the only real negative that I can think of. So for certain maybe smaller systems, I could see, or smaller game systems maybe, where there's less back and forth. Because if you're only deploying 5 units anyway, what's the deal, right?
It shouldn't be too bad.
Shouldn't be as bad. But then again, I'd be curious to hear alternate opinions. But whereas all at once, I think is interesting too, because just generally speaking, I imagine that encourages gameplay where you're trying to force your will on the opponent. There's less reaction there because if you happen to deploy first, that means it's like, okay, I have a plan and I'm going to execute it. So your deployment strategy is going to be all about I'm lining everything up to be I'm going to make a weird historical reference. It's the Schlieffen plan idea, which is a World War I idea. There's this guy Schlieffen who wrote the war plan for Germany. There's a lot of, I'm not a historian, so this is very high level. But basically, he had this whole big plan worked out for how they would deal with Russia and France at the same time. A two-sided war, right? And his whole idea was we're going to just swoop through France really quick with like 7/8 of our army. He says, remember to keep the right flank strong. The farthest right guy is going to dip his sleeve into the English Channel. We're going to sweep so far right and then slam the door. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, we're going to have like a token force to try and hold off the Russians while we just sweep France. And then once France is over, we can turn around and do that. And the idea being he's enforcing his will on his opponents. He's not reacting to them. He's saying, I'm doing this.
Yeah.
Whereas alternating, I feel like allows for more of a controlling, reactionary, and maybe cautious playstyle. Now, it's worth noting that all at once you could still be cautious, but your plan is caution. Right? Like it comes in, you're going, I'm a gun line. I'm going to back up or I'm going to stand here and you're going to get shot at as I, do the thing that I came here with my plan. Whereas, alternating, you might come into a matchup maybe and you're like, oh, in this one I need to be a little more aggressive versus this next
and you can
game.
kind of design that as you're deploying rather than needing to know from the outset.
Exactly. And I find those sorts of things really interesting because for me, I get really almost probably too into deployment. I'm going to try not to focus on fantasy here, but before certain games, when I know my list, I'll on a piece of paper even, I'll sketch out what I think I want to do.
Yeah.
Because I like having that rough plan. I like being the fake Schlieffen and being like, oh yeah, we're going to sweep from the right and it's going to be great.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I like being able to go ad hoc. Oh God, he's got his great swords with the Griffin banner on the right.
To do that with them.
Now I got to adjust because my preconceived notions were completely thrown, through the loop. And, I just find all that really interesting and how you can kind of theory craft just how you're going to approach the game. And for a lot of these games too, what I will say, I know I'm getting really deep here, so please interrupt me, but deployment has a huge impact.
It really does.
On a lot of how the games turn out. So if you out deploy your opponent in a lot of systems that I've experienced, that can just be like, maybe not the game, but it can be. But
it can be, I've been on the receiving end of that where I've botched my deployment and then my units are kind of just like blocking each other, running into each other. And this is obviously more of an issue in something like Warhammer Fantasy where you have regiments and a little bit less maneuverability, but Yeah, absolutely. Bad deployment can really botch a game for you from the get-go, and then you're fighting an uphill battle the whole time.
For sure. And there's just so much to think about in certain systems, Warhammer, anything, 40K, whatever you got, because there's so much weirdness and weird special rules. It turns into, for me, it's a lot of like just how well do you know the opposing force versus your own. And it kind of turns into like I won't call it a skill check, but it's like a knowledge check. Like, I know what those things are.
So I know what I need to do.
I know what I need to do,
yeah.
Whereas your opponent might be less experienced and go, I don't even know what your army is. I don't even know, what does rending mean? I don't know. I'll find out. Oh, I got completely eviscerated. Something like that.
Right, because you just didn't know that you put the thing that was exactly what they were here to kill right across from them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So...
Yeah, well, you bring up a really interesting point. I never thought about the full army deployment encouraging more of that, having a plan from the outset.
Okay.
And I think that's a really good point. I think that the alternating, you could still have that plan and just kind of ignore what your opponent's doing and just be doing your battle plan like you were describing, kind of drawing it out. I've cut out little squares of paper to represent my units before to kind of visualize how I would put them. I was doing that with my dwarfs, especially trying to figure out how can I make sure that my battle line stays intact, that I have my flanks covered properly. Where am I going to put my ranged units? Because I don't have the benefit of the small detachments with dwarfs, that kind of a thing. And that was really helpful for me because then going into it, I don't immediately start second guessing myself with the alternating deployment, because then it does matter just a little less what the opponent's doing because I just have my plan. And so I think that's a really helpful way to approach it, especially as a newer player, because if you force yourself to just decide on a plan of how you want your army to work against whatever opponent, and then you just commit to that plan steadfastly and carry out that plan from deployment all the way through the battle, you're going to learn a lot, because then you'll kind of know what didn't work about that plan. It's not going to be, well, I just changed my mind in the middle of deployment and just totally broke my idea of the plan. Now I can't really make any judgment calls about the rest of the battle anymore because my whole plan went out the window in the deployment phase. So I think taking that time to think through, how is my whole army supposed to work together? How is this unit going to work with this unit? What are they good at doing? And just having that plan from the outset and starting with, where am I going to deploy them obviously you have to be, something that always throws me off is terrain ends up ruining my deployment ideas. And I have to split up my army, or like, this guy doesn't fit here anymore, that sort of a thing. But yeah, I think that's a really helpful approach, just to have that pre-planned idea of how you're going to carry out the battle and then just stick to it.
Yes. One other thing, just kind of, again, jumping off that idea, I was just thinking of it, is how game systems, how they change how you approach deployment for me. And honestly, the importance of deployment is how movement and distances are treated. I feel like the more, and I'm not going to say speed because that's, everything's relative, right? Because if it's a 10 millimeter game and they move 10 inches versus it's 28 mil and they move 10 inches, it's
very different.
Which one's faster? But the idea of like, if we're playing on a 6x4 or whatever, right? But all the units can move 24 inches. Just base or whatever, let's just say. I'm making that up, by the way. But deployment probably matters a lot less, right?
Right, because you can just redeploy, kind of move wherever you want afterwards.
Is movement free form? Like you said with regiments, are we wheeling? Or are we just kind of like point to point? Like, I'm measuring 12 inches and they go there. The more free form and the more fast things are, I find the less deployment seems to matter.
That's a good point.
I think of like... we've never played anything like this, but I think of like flyers in 40K. I'm pretty sure, and don't quote me, listeners, sorry, but I'm sure they go very fast. I think they can fly like 24 inches or something, and they just kind of like, sure, they might show up on your deployment zone, but it's like turn one. They could be anywhere. They could be basically anywhere, and there's like things like turbo boosting stuff in 4th Ed 40K that can do equivalent stuff, and it's just like, well, they could be literally anywhere.
Yeah, almost. And even flyers in Warhammer Fantasy Battles, the 20-inch movement, it doesn't matter as much. Fast cavalry, this even happened in our last game where I couldn't deploy my Pistoliers exactly where I wanted to, but I had them there turn one, and so it really wasn't a big deal.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just this idea of like the more cumbersome and slow movement is, the like deployment itself is like more and more important, I find. If things are really fast, really loosey-goosey, it's like, okay, well, we can adjust. Sure, that's a bad matchup, but I'm just going to fling over there and then move over there. And that might be interesting, too, because if they have the same capabilities, then it's like, okay, well,
this is a much more dynamic battle now.
Just a crazy game. But worth noting, too, I don't know if I want, complete loosey-goosey, because I like deployment mattering. I like that there's some thought behind it. If we just showed up and just kind of dumped them all out, it's a little less interesting. That's a hyperbolic statement there. But what do you think of all that, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point, that the speed of which a game system allows you to move really then determines how important your deployment choices are. I think that's maybe one of the things that gives me analysis paralysis in Warhammer Fantasy is because it's a much more rigid movement system. It feels a lot more like I have to make the right choice now or I'm going to hamstring myself from the get-go. And so that makes me overthink it, and I'm just like waffling back and forth, and then I end up being the guy that means deployment's going to take another 20 minutes. So yeah, that's where, again, I think finding ways that you can have that plan ahead of time just so that you can move forward with it regardless of what your opponent's doing can be really helpful.
Sure.
Yeah, I think the other aspect of sort of a classical deployment system is that you're just on opposing long edges of a rectangular table.
Yeah.
Most battle-sized games are on rectangular tables. A lot of smaller skirmish games are on square tables, potentially. But yeah, being on those opposing sides where you have a long edge, so you kind of have some room to spread out, is another classic feature of those types of deployment systems. But all of those things then can get played with pretty easily, and a lot of systems in their just sort of base pack of 6 scenarios that seems to be common in most war games. There's usually one where it's like, oh, well, you do deploy on the short side this time, or maybe you deploy up a little further or in a little closer, that sort of a thing.
Yeah. Somebody's in the middle, and the other guy comes from 2 sides.
Yep, that's a classic ambush scenario. So there's all those different ways that you can kind of like put a twist on it. And I think in terms of deployment, there's maybe an argument to be made for doing a more, what we would say from like a filmmaking storytelling perspective, in media res, which means like in the middle of, so like jumping more into the action.
Sure.
Whereas something like Warhammer Fantasy, you typically have 1 to 2 turns of maneuvering before the battle lines clash. And some systems I think that works well with, where you want to create some balance between shooting and melee units. You kind of want that little bit of time for the shooting armies to get to do a little bit of their shooting.
Right.
But there's other systems that maybe benefit from jumping more straight into the action, where it's like on turn 1, our melee units are running into each other, that sort of a thing. What do you think about that?
I haven't had the privilege of playing something that aggressive, but I'm fascinated by it. I've definitely played a lot of games where you can reach out and touch someone turn 1. I don't know if any game exists that I've played where you can't really do that. Maybe War Machine a little bit, but even some units could.
Yeah.
The ranges in that game were quite low. But like I think of like BattleTech, there are things like long range missiles that can shoot out like 21 hexes. Sure, it's very they have a massive negative to hit at that range or whatever, but they can still hit you and potentially do a lot of damage, right? So those sorts of things exist, whereas it's like longbows in Fantasy, they like reach across half the table. 40K, don't get me started.
Yeah,
everybody
got your Earthshaker cannon.
It feels like everybody can just shoot everybody. That's not true. 4th Ed's pretty limited actually, but it feels like a lot of people, it's just like, well, why are we even measuring range? Because this gun has like 48 inches. It's just like, well, it could come up, but
yeah, corner to corner.
Sure. But I would actually, I'd be curious to try more systems to see how they manage that. But what it would be interesting to me is if you started in media res, as you said, would deployment then be even more important, because your matchups at that point, like,
you don't have time to redeploy.
Boom, you just go like, oh man, I put that guy there and he put that dude there, and that dude's gonna get to me turn 1. Like, can you, like, how do you manage that? Do you have to allow for people to have that build up, that approach?
Right. Yeah, and I think it's a game design decision that you kind of have to make when you're doing the design, is how do you want that first little bit to go? I know some people are just annoyed by like, oh, it feels like the first whole turn, why did we even do that?
We just moved up.
Right. But I totally agree with you that there is a lot of strategy and tactical decision making happening during that maneuvering turn, where you are trying to outmaneuver your opponent, maybe set up a you've talked about this before, but giving your opponent two bad options where no matter which one they make, something else bad is going to happen to them. And that can only happen with a little bit of that time to move into those positions. Of course, obviously, if you, like you said, you could still do that maybe with the deployment up close. It just puts more of that emphasis on the deployment itself.
Right, it's less about and I guess that leads to the question of for players, if we took a poll, then maybe we will, I don't know. But is deployment like part of the game? Do you get like excited about deployment? I get kind of excited about it, and it is part of the game for me. But I wonder if some people roll their eyes and are just like, I kind of just want to...
Yeah, if you gave me a pre-made deployment map, I would use it.
Yeah, I don't know how many of those people exist.
Yeah, I don't know.
Maybe somebody's out there that is just like, I just don't care. I'd rather just play the game. But just get to the fighting or whatever. But or have it like be randomized to try and make it some sort of fairness there.
I think it just makes me anxious. I don't know. I feel like
fair.
I've done bad deployment enough times where it feels like I've had worse outcomes in the game because of poor deployment choices that I go into it just nervous that I'm going to make those mistakes again. So I think, just working through that is definitely a process to try to figure out, okay, how can I just make confident decisions, which I guess this just keeps circling back to your idea of just have a plan from the get-go of how you want things to work out and just stick to that plan and see how it goes.
Sure. This leads me to thinking about like what are types of deployment that we haven't seen that I would be curious about. I haven't seen a lot of, and maybe you have. Please educate me, viewers or listeners, educate me. But is there ever fully blind deployment? Do we ever do anything sort of, you know how in our last scenario we wrote out our battle lines?
Yeah. That's like half blind.
That was half blind because you didn't know what order I was deploying in, but you still saw me place the unit, and then you could react with your next unit.
Yeah, that's actually one of my notes I had as well.
Oh, really?
Is that hidden deployment or blind deployment is really hard to implement.
Right.
I remember seeing in old Wargaming books, it might have even been the General's Compendium from Warhammer Fantasy Battles. But there's the idea of you can put a giant cardboard divider along the middle of the table, and I remember seeing this picture of that in an old book. And then you just deploy your whole army, they deploy their whole army, then you pull away the cardboard, and voila, there it is. I've never actually tried that. That is kind of interesting to me. But I think the benefit of a hidden deployment approach is that it helps simulate the fog of war, where there are elements of the enemy army that you wouldn't really know where they are or how they're going to come at you, that sort of a thing. I've seen other systems that use unit counters, and sometimes there's false counters, so you don't know. Quadrant 13 is one of those. It's like a company level sci-fi game.
Okay.
That was sort of a riff on, I think, Too Fat Lardy's I Ain't Been Shot Mum. But they have that as an option for deployment, where all of your units and then maybe a couple extra ones have these markers, so you know that there is enemy movement happening.
Sure.
But you don't know until you make a spotting roll to identify what that unit is, and then it reveals itself.
Yeah, no, I think stuff like that, what you just described, I think could be explored a lot more in a lot of interesting ways. And that's why I'm kind of interested in things like, I haven't played Chain of Command like you have, where it's you spawn up kind of in the fight, but it's also are those spawns known ahead of time?
They are. So that's one thing that this gets into deployment as well, but one of the really interesting elements of Chain of Command is the patrol phase is what they call it. So you start typically with 3 patrol markers, and so those represent your troops going out and patrolling the area, and then you get to move them alternating with your opponent. But when you get close enough to an enemy patrol marker, it locks both of them down because they kind of see each other, and they're maybe firing a couple warning shots, but they're not going to really move any closer to each other yet.
I love that, actually.
And so then once all the patrol markers are locked down, you then use those to determine where do you put your jump off points, is what they call the spawn points. And so that represents as far forward as you could go safely before you know that there's enemy that could shoot you. So there's certain restrictions on that, it has to be behind cover and out of line of sight of the enemy positions, things like that.
Sure.
And so that creates a much more realistic feeling deployment situation where it's we know the way to get up to behind that barn, and we know the enemy's on the other side of it, but we can safely just move up to that barn without needing to worry about it. Right. But then that also can ebb and flow during the game, where you can capture an enemy jump off point. You could move one of your jump off points up potentially by securing new ground, that sort of a thing. But then, like you're saying, the deployment is then essentially completely hidden because none of your troops come on until you decide to bring them on from a jump off point through using your activation dice. And for me, that's been the most interesting and compelling deployment system that I've ever encountered, and I really enjoy it.
Whenever I hear you talk about it, I'm always fascinated by that part. I don't even know anything about like how shooting resolution happens. I don't know. I assume you roll dice and
you do roll dice.
You count hits or something. But
yeah, the whole system is honestly really brilliant. They just came out with the 2nd edition, so we should get it on the table sometime.
Dang it, all these games. But no, stuff like that I feel like could be explored so much more because it's just. I shouldn't say that I'm sad, but I feel like everything's kind of just a 40K copy. A lot of new stuff. It's just like, big crazy model that's got a bajillion tentacles, and we put it down, and you put your crazy model with a billion tentacles down, and then we just run at each other and shoot too. And then there's a bunch of special rules, and that could be really interesting. Don't get me wrong. I think there's a place for it. But I feel like we've got a lot of that, and I want to see more of the crazy, maybe not even crazy, but that's just interesting, and I feel like that models something in a realistic way.
Yeah.
And then maybe gets rid of some of that analysis paralysis where you're like, oh man, I'm putting this down and it's very final. Now it's like its own mini game.
Right. And as you're deploying, you're just reacting to the battlefield situation a little bit more directly. And I think the scale of the game also works for that. Also, the era of it. Obviously, if you're talking about like an ancient battle, it is a little more likely that you would know the nature and makeup of the army as it's marching towards you, because you have your scouts kind of seeing that, or you can just see them across the valley and you just see them all already lined up kind of a thing. But in World War II, that's not the case. There was much more fog of war in that sense, where you weren't really sure what the enemy was doing or the different elements because they weren't all together in some giant battle line like that.
Yeah.
So I think that's something to keep in mind as well. I don't think that the chain of command deployment system is something you could just apply to any era, any genre kind of a thing either, despite me enjoying it a lot. But yeah, I think you could apply it to a lot of different sci-fi things, anything that's sort of like Platoon plus level-ish.
Sure. I guess, and my comment was more, and I don't think you took it this way, but it's more just like, I want to see people push the boundaries a little bit more. I feel like I see a lot of the same, and I want to see more crazy things. And maybe that's out there, and I'm just not looking for it. So
it's entirely possible.
Please link me. Please link us.
Too many games.
There are a lot of games. I am addicted to rule books, but I would love to see different types of things, because again, I just feel like the mainstream stuff is all
pretty copy paste,
kind of copy paste, and where the diversity comes is usually in the dice resolution or something,
if anything, or it's just different names for the special rules that are all the same.
Yeah, it's like, well, this guy's good at fighting or whatever, and this game, and we're Infinity, and we use D20 opposed roll-offs, and we're War Machine, we use a 2d6 system that you can boost to 3d6, and and then War Machine, or Warhammer, sorry, is just buckets of dice. I hope you like rolling lots of D6s and just picking them up and throwing them again, and it's great.
Yeah, that's interesting, because there are those differences in some of the mechanics, but there's a lot of the periphery of the game experience that is pretty identical.
Yeah, it's just like, well, we got units, and they all have kind of similar stat values. I'm waxing lyrical here.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's like all the scenarios, at least the ones in the book, they're all kind of the same layout. And I get it. You want to have good base scenarios. You can do anything you want. The player can take the system and mold it. I think we've shown that. But the core, just like deployment rules, though, are often left wanting.
Yeah.
Occasionally, you'll get something kind of interesting, like the Chameleon Skinks rule in Warhammer Fantasy. Like, there's nothing quite like that. They can get really deep in the enemy army, like turn one. That's really unique to them and cool. But they're the only thing in I think the entire game that can basically do that. Other than that, it's just like, well, they scout and they're kind of like forward deployed kind of, and that's about it most of the time. 40K has, I'd say the most interesting thing is probably Deep Strike. I think that's kind of interesting, although it's very random and occasionally just terrible.
Right, because you can just die.
Yeah, so... but I like that those options exist, though, and I think they add a little bit of spice in what can otherwise be a little samey.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the idea of reserve rules is another area that's ripe for exploration.
Yeah.
Because the idea that you're not going to commit your entire force all at once, but you're rather going to commit part of it, kind of see how things are going, and then bring in reinforcements where and when they're needed is really interesting. Again, Chain of Command allows you to kind of do that with their system. But I think a lot of times maybe that works best at, again, those larger like ground scale games with smaller scale figures where you have a big enough battlefield that kind of can work, where you have a central division fighting, but then you have this other, flanking division that you're going to bring on, but you need to decide which flank they're going to come in on, and you can wait to do that. But in something that's only 6 turns long and your reserves maybe come in on turn 3, and then they might not even come in, and then by the time they come in on turn 5, then now they're too late to really do anything to change the course of the battle. We've seen that happen plenty of times.
And for other, let's say they could even get involved. A lot of times my problem, this is the difference here, would be like unit ranges. So like, let's say 40K, a unit shows up turn 3. Sure, he gets to participate, but those first 2 turns that they were held in reserve, if the opponent didn't hold the equivalent in reserve, that just means there was 2 more turns where they shot you with that much more guys, stuff. Not always the case, but that's the idea. And it's just like, am I just gimping myself? Whereas exactly what you said, the problem is we're limited by this board scale. Like, we're on 6x4s. Sure, maybe we could do 8x4s, but not everybody can do that. It's just this, like, if we were all able to do these more interesting things, and maybe that just means we all need to play 10 millimeter. I don't know, but I want to be able to, have a reserve and then be like, oh man, my flank is crumbling. I need to throw the reserves there and be like, make that a choice.
Right. And you actually can do it in the amount of time that the time scale of the battle is happening.
And I'm sure maybe some listeners are like, you could do that. You could just like do a custom scenario where the dwarf guys just show up, and they just show up like behind the battle line. But I don't know, for me that's just like, well, where were they earlier? Were they under the ground?
Well, but also anyone can do that anytime. But like, how about a system that's built into and balanced and like kind of well designed to work thoroughly?
So I just feel like that would be really cool to see more of that, where you can have a reserve and it doesn't feel like you're gimping yourself, or you're just holding it for like the silver bullet, like, oh, I'm dropping the guy with the melta-gun to shoot the tank.
That was a classic tactic of mine as a kid, my Tau versus my brother's Imperial Guard,
which I respect. But it's just like, that's kind of like what I see it used most for and most talked about for. It's like, well, I'm gonna drop the guy that shoots the thing, or I'm dropping the thing that will charge the thing. Right. And that's like the silver bullet or whatever. It's not like you're bringing them in to reinforce. Maybe
it never really feels that way. No, because again, I think especially with 40K Warhammer and its equivalents, it's an issue of like just the time scale of the battle is that by the time they come on, they're too far from the action to do much, unless they're deep striking in 40K or something like that. Or there's, again, special scenario rules that bring them in a different spot. The one interesting thing I've seen in 4th edition 40K is some scenarios have both players they can only deploy like their HQ and 2 troops or something like that at the beginning of the battle, and then the rest of their unit types have to come in later. And it's sort of mimicking this idea of like patrols clashing and then calling in their reinforcements. And since that's built in for both sides, it creates a little bit more of that feeling of an escalating battle. That I think works.
I think that's
better
really
than
good.
Like being a choice, but even so, I think it still falls into some of those same issues.
Well, it gets rid of the whole kind of, if you've forced everybody to kind of, okay, everybody's getting reserves, then you get rid of the, oh man, he got all of his heavy support choices first, and I didn't get any. Oh, he shot me with all these big things, like for 2 more turns before mine even appeared. So now when they did show up, everything else left is already like either maybe not completely destroyed, but like heavily impacted potentially. So, and that's never a feel good.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of room for exploration there. Again, there probably are games that are doing all sorts of interesting things. So let us know in the comments. One other thought I had about the visibility of units that I saw that maybe sort of split the difference between completely hidden versus completely open is Muskets and Tomahawks by Studio Tomahawks, the same people that do Saga. But this is as indicated by the name, sort of a musket era thing. Like French and Indian War, American Revolution, all those sorts of things. But they have, now it's been a while since I've read the rule book, so I might be getting some of the details wrong here, but I think everything's deployed on the table initially, but you're not allowed to shoot at an enemy unit or react to the enemy unit until you get a certain distance to them and make a spotting roll or something like that. So you have to become aware of them, and that's done on a unit by unit basis, I think. And so
a different way to handle fog of war.
Yeah. So you still kind of know where things are, but you can't necessarily make sure that your troops are going to react to them when you want them to react. And that, I think things like that, things like chain of command help solve a weird issue. I was talking to a guy a few years ago now, but he was bemoaning war games in general because of a bad experience that he had at a convention where he tried a game of, I don't know what it was, bolt action or something. I really don't remember. But he said there was a situation where historically this anti-tank gun had a longer range than the tank or whatever. So, or maybe it was the tank had the longer range than the anti-tank gun. So the tank could just sit out of range of the anti-tank gun and blow it up.
This dude sounds like a grognard. I like this guy.
But that the tank gun had to be deployed at the beginning so that everybody knew where it was. So it was entirely possible to just outmaneuver it with my tank because I know where your tank gun is, so I can just sit out of its range, and it's no big deal.
And historically, they probably would have hid those, so the tank didn't know where it was, and then the tank drives up, goes, oh, I'm in a field, and there's a tank gun over there that I don't see. Boom.
Yep. Yeah. And that's where things like Chain of Command can model that now.
Sure.
That's something I've done in games of Chain of Command against my brother, where, you do wait until that moment, and then you suddenly reveal, oh, yeah, there was this tank gun hidden here by this jump-off point, and that overcomes some of those issues. So I think, it's interesting that for that guy, for whatever reason, like it was almost the deployment type of the game turned him off to all war games because he just really was not happy with how that went.
Jeez.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think, but no, you're right. That's the start. And if the start of the game isn't fun, you're right. It has such a big impact. That's actually such a great example. And if, you are especially in a historical game, why are we playing, right? Because we like the history of it. This is ahistorical. This is creating ahistorical outcomes. Why are we using this system or whatever? I'm not an expert on bolt action, by the way, guys. So maybe bolt action is S tier simulation of.
I don't even know if it was bolt action that this guy was talking about.
I have no idea what system we're talking about, but whatever. The point is deployment really matters. It's the core part of initiating the game. When you arrive at the table, it's putting your plan into place. For most systems, I haven't seen anything like the mythical, what I talked about earlier, the 24-inch.
Sure, yeah.
Everybody's flying around, scooting on a 6x4. Because, that's different if you're playing on a 30 by 40 foot backyard game. Then 24 inches is nothing. But, on a typical war game board, that would be crazy, and then it's like, who cares about anything? But I just wanted then, unless you have final comments. Do you have final
I think we
comments?
kind of covered my thoughts on deployment.
Okay. Then I want to jump to just kind of general, real quick here, because I think we've waxed lyrical a little bit. But for me, what I want to end on is this idea for people who maybe are playing war games and are really struggling. What's really helped me get better is when you are deploying, before you set your unit down, whatever game it is, think about what the unit's going to be doing in 2 turns.
Yes.
Don't just put it there and go that's fine or whatever, or I'm going to put it there and we'll see what happens, or I want them to fight those guys. I'm going to put it across from them. Think about what do they do in 2 turns, not just 1 turn, because 1 turn is probably pretty evident for most people when they're making this decision. It's I'm going to put it here and I'm going to move forward. Thinking 2 turns at least, maybe 3. Be like, what am I doing with this long term? And that has been something that's really helped me place units and allow me to, I think, be a little bit more successful on the table. Because if you put it down with, again, that plan, and this is kind of a part of that, but this is for me a way to strategize it without necessarily getting out a piece of paper and drawing arrows. Just being like, those source cavalry, what am I doing with them? What do I want to do with them? If I put them here, well, in 2-3 turns they might be up there and maybe they'll be fighting those guys. Am I okay with that? Yeah, I think I am. Okay, put them there. But if I put them over here, maybe they're just going to be kind of in no man's land. Maybe they'll impact the board. I'm not sure. Maybe I won't put them there. But that's just been something that I've always noticed. And like you've mentioned, deployment can be really, I think, intimidating for new players because, and it probably depends. I'm sure some new players come in and they're like, I don't even know what's going on.
Yeah,
put them wherever. Some people are like, who cares? But other people might be a little more, I don't want to make a mistake.
Right.
So they waffle. So if you're one of those people, just think, what am I going to do with it in 2 turns?
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful approach. It almost in a way is like evoking the approach people have to chess. Like you have to be thinking multiple turns ahead. I never got very good at chess because I was really bad at doing that. So it's like, well, I can move this guy here and he won't die immediately, so I'll do that. But I wasn't really thinking, how am I setting up like a fork or something where I'm actually going to be able to take an enemy piece and that sort of a thing. So I think that that's a really good approach to that. Another thing that I gleaned from that Hitchhiker's Guide to Playing the Empire PDF was the idea of doing a lot of that pre-planning ahead of time, like when you're building your army list and knowing what is the purpose of each unit in your army and like what it's supposed to be dealing with in terms of enemy threats, and sort of categorizing those things as like, what is like the really strong enemy stuff? What's the enemy distraction things? Like, what of my units deal with distractions? What of my units deal with the really dangerous stuff?
Right.
And all those sorts of things. So again, some of that pre-planning I think can help a lot as well.
For sure. So all this to say, we think deployment's really cool. We think it's fun, but it can be tense.
Yeah.
But we also want to see more diversity.
Yeah, and just the systems.
So,
and then I think we can't end this episode without talking about a specific type of deployment called a refused flank.
Oh,
since,
yes.
Of course, that is the namesake of our podcast.
I think it works pretty well in most war games, honestly.
Yeah, you want to describe what a refused flank deployment is?
A refused flank is, generally speaking, you're going to put a strong flank, or one of your flanks is going to be strong, whereas the other one you're going to basically refuse it. You're not going to allow contact. I actually kind of almost did this in our last battle report if I had continued to back up with those Saurus warriors.
Yeah.
But the idea is to kind of overcome one side of your opponent, and
with
then kind
more of your force,
with more of your force, while making their other side kind of pointless and useless. It's kind of like you're turning your army into a door, is the way I like to think of it, and you're kind of swinging it obliquely.
That's a good image, yeah. And I think maybe a really simple way to think about it in terms of like a 4x6 table. If your deployment zone is 6 feet long, you can break that into 3 2-foot sections. You have a left flank, a center, and a right flank. And if your opponent deploys their entire army evenly spaced out across all of that, but you put your whole army in the center and right flank, now a third of their army is going to spend part of the game doing nothing because it's not across from any of your units, whereas you have more focused energy and power to go against less of their army. So you have a whole of your army against 2/3 of their army. So the idea being, like you're saying, that you're going to close that door, you're going to be able to overwhelm their flank with your extra power, while hoping that their now refused flank that they don't have fighting anything is not going to make it in time.
It's inconsequential. By the time they maybe get to you, their entire flank has been hit, and now maybe your strong side is coming up to hit them, to now pincer them potentially.
Right, in the flank or the rear or something.
So now they're just pinned. So that's like a general strategy, obviously very high level, and per system rather, it's probably more or less effective. But that's something that I like in fantasy anyway, and maybe other historical systems that I could see being modeled, just because generally those systems reward flanks and stuff like that. Systems that are more loosey-goosey about that, especially at a smaller level, maybe not as impactful. But the idea, as you noted, of just having a strong point and kind of punching through on a point that isn't as strong, and then denying their strong point as a concept, is usually a winning strategy in my experience. Obviously, scenarios, your mileage may vary, but I like it. Refuse your flanks, folks. They work.
Yeah, if you've ever done that successfully, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear stories about how the name of our podcast has helped you. But yeah, do you have any final thoughts on deployment, Grant?
Just that it... You know what? No, I'm not going to wax anymore. I do not have any more final thoughts. I think we've done just enough, and I want to hear all the different systems. Please do. If you know of a cool system that handles deployment in a unique way, I would love to just tell me the name. I'll look into it. You don't have to send me, a PDF or a link to their website. I will look for it.
But feel free to do that.
But feel free to do that. I am genuinely curious, because this is something where I'm really kind of interested in it.
Yeah.
But I do see a lot of the same, and I want to see more unique stuff. I want to see more chain of commands. I want to see more, Quadrant 13.
Yeah.
I want to see more of that stuff. The tomahawk, bone and tomahawk, is that what you said?
Muskets and tomahawks.
Muskets and tomahawks. I want to say the names right. I want to see more of that. outside, just as a conceptual, like mechanical level. I want to see it different
Built
in
into
that
the
way.
system,
Built
yeah.
into the system. I don't want to just see, oh, for this game we're doing weird custom rules that I've wrote. I want built into the system, unique stuff that's different and evokes what it's actually trying to model.
Yeah.
So, ka-chow. Any final thoughts from you?
No, I have no final thoughts on deployment. I've said it all.
Before we delay this any longer, thank you for listening. This is Refused Flank.
Bye.
Bye.